Hi guys, and welcome to Chapter 3. Chapter 3, just like Chapter 2, only has 2 lectures in it. The first is going to be going over an introduction to evolution. That's what this lecture is today. And then the next is when we're going to go over an introduction into the general principles of ecology. Now, Chapter 3 and Chapter 4 are 2 of my favorite chapters in the entire course. I really like getting into the nuts and bolts of evolution and ecology, and I hope you guys enjoy them just as much as I do. All right, let's get started. So before we get into the nuts and bolts of evolution, we're just going to touch on a few quick ecology terms. These are going to be things that are important to keep in mind within the context of evolution. And so we're just going to go over some definitions really quickly at different scales of looking at ecology. The first is a species, and a species is defined as a particular kind of organism whose members share genetic and physical characteristics with one another, and this is important, they can breed with one another to produce fertile offspring. Now, that last part is really important because a lot of animals, a lot of different species can actually mate with one another to produce offspring. For example, a lion and a tiger can mate together to produce a liger. A donkey and a horse can mate together to produce a mule. However, the key component in that definition is that the offspring has to be fertile themselves. In the case of a mule, for example, a donkey-horse hybrid, mules are actually sterile. Same with a liger. A liger is also sterile. And so these hybrid organisms, usually they're going to be sterile organisms, and so they cannot continue that genetic lineage. So again, a species has to be a group of organisms that share genetic characteristics, share physical characteristics, and can breed together to produce fertile offspring. Now, the next is a population. A population is defined as a group of individuals from the same species in a given area. Now, populations can change depending on whether we look at a very large geographic area or a very small geographic area, but it is just a group of individuals from the same species regardless of what area we are looking at. Moving a little bit broader in scope, so a community is defined as an assemblage of populations, so an aggregation of multiple populations, and we're looking now at different species and multiple individuals within each species that live in the same area and interact with one another in that same area. So we started with our single organism or our species, then we moved to the population of that species. Now we are at the community level, which we have multiple populations for different species in the same area. Then we're going to combine everything together when we look at the ecosystem level. And the ecosystem level refers to the biological communities, the ones we just talked about, multiple species, multiple populations, that live and interact with one another, and in addition, the non-living or the abiotic communities with which they interact in a given area. So remember, we defined ecosystem in the second lecture of Chapter 2 when we were talking about all of the living organisms and the non-living entities with which they interact. Here we are looking at the same definition. This hasn't changed. However, we are now giving that biological component a more in-depth glance. So instead of just saying all biological organisms, we now see the structure of an ecosystem as well. So we see the different species that live in them, we see the different populations, the different communities, and then finally we add in the different abiotic components. So it's still the same definition as Chapter 2, it's just now focusing a little bit more in depth on those biological components of an ecosystem. So now that we have gone over our quick terms for ecology, we can now apply them within the context of evolution. And evolution is extremely important in biology. It's been said that nothing in biology actually makes sense without the broader context of evolution. And evolution is defined as the change in populations of organisms over time. Now, a couple of quick notes here. Evolution is actually the source of all biological diversity, and it should really be noted here that individual organisms cannot evolve. Only populations of organisms evolve over time, and we're going to break down exactly why that is. First of all, the changes that are occurring in these populations occur from the transition from one generation to another. They are basically going to arise from the transition from parent to offspring. So when a parent passes down traits to those offsprings, it's in that passage of traits that changes or alterations can occur. So individuals cannot evolve, Populations can evolve over time. And in addition, gene alterations, something called mutations, which we're going to dive into here in just a second, are the ultimate source of evolution. Without alterations in genetics, we would have no genetic variability and we would have no evolution. So let's dive into the nuts and bolts of some of these genetic components and exactly what is going on here. And when we talk about evolution, it's really important that we go into some detail about the mechanism with which evolution actually operates and takes place, and that is something called natural selection. Natural selection basically is a principle that characteristics which enhance survival in a population or a species are passed down from one generation to the next. Now, for example, in a population of giraffes, longer necks on giraffes living in an area with really tall trees would enhance the survival of those giraffes with long necks relative to giraffes with shorter necks. So essentially, natural selection would favor the longer necks on a giraffe relative to the shorter necks on other giraffes within that population. And natural selection essentially explains patterns in nature. Essentially, when we talk about a population or a species, there's going to be genetic variability within that species. They're going to have slightly different characteristics. For example, me and you, I have dark brown hair, you might have blonde hair or red hair or light brown hair. There are genetic variability in a population within the same species. Now, that genetic variation means that members of the same species can be slightly different, and those slight differences can either improve or hinder an animal or species' ability to survive and reproduce. And an adaptive trait or an adaptation is essentially a trait, like hair, for example, or the length of your neck. That is a trait, and an adaptation is a trait that promotes reproductive success. Basically, it promotes the likelihood that you are going to survive in the wild, given the environmental conditions, to the point where you can pass on your genes to the next generation. You can have babies, and those babies will also persist in the environment. So that reproductive success is really, really important, because that is the mechanism that those genetics, those genes, are passed on from your genes to the next generation. Now, environmental conditions, whether a habitat is hot or cold, whether it has tall trees or short trees, that variability is going to really determine the path of natural selection, because it's going to determine what traits are favorable for that organism, what enhances its survival, and what traits can actually hurt an organism. So if the trees are really short, for example, going back to our giraffe example, then a long neck wouldn't necessarily have been a favorable trait. It might have been really hard for a giraffe to bend its neck down and eat off the short trees, and in that scenario, the long neck may have been decreasing the likelihood of that giraffe to survive, and in which case a shorter neck could be favorable. So what I want to pass along here, what I'm trying to get across, is that the environmental conditions dictate what traits are going to be favorable, and so what traits are going to be passed down via the mechanism of natural selection. And so all of this information and all of this knowledge brings us to a very concise and coherent definition of what natural selection actually is. Natural selection is the process by which inherited characteristics that enhance the chances of survival and reproduction get passed down more frequently than characteristics which do not enhance survival and reproduction. And natural selection is supported by three specific facts. You need to know this for your exam. I cannot stress that enough. And these three specific facts are that organisms face a constant struggle to survive and reproduce. That's number one. Number two is that organisms tend to produce more offspring than can survive to adulthood. Organisms innately use the strategy, whether they know it or not, that some of their offspring are not going to make it to adulthood. So they produce as many offspring as possible, because it increases the chances that at least some of those offspring are going to survive long enough to reproduce themselves. And finally, the last principle is that organisms vary in their attributes. Now, all of these were things that we discussed in the previous slide, but it kind of gets distilled into this concise definition and these three specific facts. Now that we have discussed evolution and the mechanism through which evolution operates, natural selection, we can get into some of those genetic alterations that we were talking about in some of the earlier slides. And when we talk about genetics, we really need to understand that the fundamental blueprint for our genetic information comes in something called DNA. DNA, or deribonucleic acid, is a self-replicating material which is present in nearly all living organisms. And DNA is an organic compound that is the carrier of all of our genetic information. Everything you are, everything that you ever will be, is encoded into the DNA that exists in every one of your cells. And specifically within DNA molecules are specific sequences that encode specific attributes, and those are known as genes. And examples of genes could be genetic encoding for whether you have brown hair or blonde hair, whether you have blue eyes or green eyes, whether you're short or tall, whether you have dark skin or pale skin. All of the characteristics that make you you are encoded in the genes that are within your DNA. Now, for an organism to be able to reproduce, that entails copying its DNA and then passing those copies along to its offspring. Now, DNA is a really complex process, and so not all copying is always done correctly. There are a lot of molecules in a very long sequence of DNA that have to be copied perfectly, and more often than not, that doesn't actually happen. And so errors in copies of DNA are known as mutations, and there are several types of mutations. So most mutations are actually neutral. They don't actually do anything. The mutation has to do with a minor switch in a little bit of the information, and normally that switch doesn't actually do anything to the trait, and it doesn't really harm the organism. So while most mutations are neutral, there are some that are beneficial and there are some that are harmful. Now, usually, if a mutation isn't neutral, it tends to be harmful. And what we call a harmful mutation is a deleterious mutation. And what this means is that that mutation tends to lower the chances of survival in that organism. A great example of a mutation that's almost always deleterious or bad is the mutation of albinism. Basically, if an organism is albino, meaning that it doesn't have pigment in its skin, it is more sensitive to UV radiation. An example is an albino frog versus a green tree frog. And so what happens is that organism tends to get sunburnt far more often. It's more sensitive to radiation. It has higher incidences of skin cancer as a result, and it tends to not be able to survive in the wild as well as an organism without that bad mutation. So a great example of a mutation that is harmful is albinism, or an organism being albino. Now, much more rarely, mutations can actually be beneficial, meaning that they increase the chances of survival of that organism. A great example is a long neck in a giraffe, the ability to be a little bit stronger or to heal quicker. All of these are changes in DNA that would be beneficial to the organism. So while most DNA mutations are neutral, some, more often than not, if they're not neutral, are bad for you, and very rarely, mutations can be good for a given organism. Now, in the rare instance that a DNA mutation is actually beneficial to an organism, a beneficial mutation will spread via natural selection through a population to the extent to which that mutation will increase the survivorship or the ability of a given organism with that mutation to survive throughout the population. So basically what we're saying is that how fast a beneficial mutation spreads through a population is directly related to how beneficial that mutation is to an organism. Organisms with beneficial mutations are more likely to survive. That's something that we learned when we were talking about natural selection. And so organisms which are more likely to survive are also more likely to pass on their helpful genes, including that mutation, to the next generation. Organisms with less helpful genes, or organisms without that beneficial mutation, are less likely to die off, and so they don't get a chance to pass along their genes. And so adaptation is the gradual accumulation of better and better genes in a species population that gradually makes the offspring of that population, generation after generation, increasingly better equipped to survive in a given environment. So in the example below, where we have our snails gradually changing over time, in our original example, we have variations. So we have most snails apparently have a white shell, and apparently one snail gained a mutation in that it has a brown shell. So there's some variation in the initial population. However, it turns out that brown shell allowed that originally white snail to blend in with maybe the dirt and the leaf litter on the ground. And because that shell is now brown, it is that snail is less likely to be eaten by, say, a bird who likes to eat the white snails. So the brown snails are now better suited to survive in that environment. That makes the trait of having a brown shell really beneficial. And so all of a sudden, brown-shelled snails are now able to survive much better than their white-shelled snail counterparts. And so because of that, these brown-shelled snails are now able to pass on their genetic information to the next generation at far higher frequencies than the white-shelled snails. As a result, after a few generations over and over again, eventually white-shelled snails are no longer found in the population at all because it's not a beneficial mutation, and instead the population has shifted from predominantly white snails to predominantly brown snails. This is adaptation of a population in a species through time given natural selection. And again, I really want to emphasize here that no single organism is changing. No single organism started off as a white snail and became a brown snail. The brown-shelled snails were born as brown-shelled snails. What happened here is that one day two white-shelled snails were mating, and in the mating, when they were creating that offspring, there was an error in their DNA transcribing from their DNA to the new offspring. The change happened when they were making the new organism. The new organism, the offspring, didn't start out as white and turn brown. It was made brown as an original error when the DNA was being copied. So we keep in mind that, again, individuals cannot evolve. They were only born a certain way. Populations over time, like we've just seen, are what are actually evolving. Now, going back to our example, we're going to go back to those three major facts of natural selection, and given what we know about natural selection and DNA mutation, we're going to reiterate some of those specific facts with the information that we have learned. Number one, if you recall, was that organisms face a constant struggle to survive and reproduce, and that is because usually environments are harsh and unforgiving. It can be really hard to survive in given environments, and organisms which cannot survive, or organisms which survive less frequently than others, cannot reproduce, and so they cannot pass their genetic information on to the next generation. In addition, our second fact, if you remember, was that organisms tend to produce more offspring than can survive to adulthood. So if an organism produces 3 offspring, chances are those 3 offspring are not all going to grow to adulthood and survive to reproduce and contribute to the next generation after their own. So again, by producing lots of offspring, organisms increase the odds that at least one of their offspring will survive to reproduce and contribute to the next generation. And finally, organisms vary in their attributes. Not all organisms in the population are genetically identical. In fact, no organism in a population is genetically identical. And that variability basically accounts for differences in the ability of any one organism to survive. Some organisms are naturally just better equipped to survive in a given environment. And so better equipped organisms are more likely to survive, and so gradually, over time, only organisms that have a given mutation or a given set of adaptations are going to contribute that information or their genetic material to future generations, and so gradually over time, the entire population changes. This is evolution in a nutshell. And eventually, over time, if we look at a population of organisms can change over time so much that it no longer even remotely resembles its original species. And this is the process of speciation. Basically, this is how new species branch off from original old species. And so when we talk about speciation, what we're saying is that a population of a given species has acquired so many new adaptations or has changed so much over time that it no longer resembles what it was originally. And keep in mind that this doesn't necessarily have to be linear. This can actually branch out. And so a single original population of a given species can be separated in some way and actually branch off to form 2 entirely new species. And this is how we actually gain more species and contribute to biodiversity. And so allopatric speciation is basically speciation from geographic separation. Basically, sometimes a species, just like we just mentioned, gets separated in some way. Maybe a population gets separated by a giant mountain, or maybe a segment of a population gets stranded on an island. In some way, a segment or a population of a given species is separated in some way to which these two different subpopulations are exposed to different environmental conditions. Now remember that environmental conditions drive the path that natural selection takes. So if two subpopulations are exposed to different environmental conditions, there are going to be different adaptations that are going to be advantageous in each new environment, meaning that each different subpopulation is going to change over time in different ways. And so over time, these populations will acquire adaptations that are beneficial to the specific environmental conditions that they're subjected to, and eventually, after enough time passes, these two subpopulations are going to evolve into two entirely different species. However, there is a new type of selection that is driving a lot of speciation these days, and that is something called artificial selection, or something you may have referred to as domestication in the past. Now, keep in mind that natural selection is selection according to natural variation, that natural variation in different environmental conditions. Basically, the probability that a given trait will spread through a population directly depends on how helpful that trait is in the organism's habitat in those given environmental conditions. So if there are really tall trees, a really tall neck on a giraffe would be really beneficial. If there are really short trees, a really short neck would be beneficial. Basically, natural selection is dependent on variation in the natural environment. However, artificial selection is selection according to humans. Basically, specific traits here are selected under human direction. So if we like a trait, we will breed two organisms with that trait together to produce new organisms. And in this case, the probability that a given trait will spread through a population directly depends on whether humans select for that trait in an organism. So this is again sometimes known as domestication or breeding, and artificial selection is the key driver in the formation of things like dogs and cats, different crop cultivars, and chickens. Fun fact is that chickens didn't actually exist ever in the wild. They were bred from two different species of wild fowl, different types of birds, and over time emerged as their own specific species. So this is artificial selection directly in contrast to the natural selection that we just talked about. Now that is everything we have for evolution. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Next we'll be doing an introduction into ecology. I'll see you then.